Ivanka Trump joined German Chancellor Angela Merkel and other women leaders at a conference in Berlin to talk about women's participation in the economy and female empowerment. This is an hour and a half.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Berlin, to this panel with 8 inspiring women who have joined us today to discuss how to scale up women's entrepreneurship. Our question is, what key factors would promote women's entrepreneurship and what barriers do we need to overcome? I'm very honored and happy to host this panel with the participants who have just been introduced to you, and so we can immediately jump into the discussion on the future of women in business and economics. And I would like to start with you, Your Majesty. If this is fine. Oh, some problem? We are trying to do the translation, do the talk in English and German, and you have the translation on your earpod that you could find on your chair. So, first question to you, Your Majesty. I'd like to start with you because you have been the UN Secretary General's Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance for Development since 2009, and you're the Honorary Chairwoman of the G20 Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, dedicated to financial inclusion. Is that still the biggest challenge in the process of including women in business, that they are not financially included?
Well, first of all, let me tell you how happy I am to be here, and that the Chancellor has actually followed this issue of bringing women into the G20, because I think it's extremely important. First of all, let me say that there's no silver bullet in actually trying to get women more economically empowered and having more entrepreneurship within women. And also there's no size fits all. It's not the same amount of policies you're actually going to have in the Netherlands or in DRC or in Colombia and Pakistan. At least in my travels, this is what I have been experienced. Financial inclusion is one of the very big stumble blocks, I would say, but not the only one. Financial inclusion is in combination with many other issues that need to be addressed so that really women can actually become economically empowered. And I would like to say that this is an issue that is universal. It's true to Africa, Latin America, Asia, but also in my country, the Netherlands. I mean, only 1/3 of all the enterprises are actually led by women. So we have a lot of work to do. Also, sometimes poverty in some households has the face of women. So we really need to do a lot of work. And we are doing, and we are advancing. But still, a lot of work has to be done. What do I see as the challenges, apart from financial inclusion? I have to say the improvement of business environment in general, for both men and women, is extremely important. Because if it's easier to do business in a given country, it's going to be easier for a woman to do business in that country. So I think that, general environment for doing business is extremely important. Specifically to financial inclusion, I would say there are really laws and regulations sometimes are impeding, like sometimes they are unable to open an account. And that's certainly true for many countries. Sometimes they are unable to hold property, inherit property. Sometimes there are issues of customs. Sometimes they cannot get out of the house alone, so therefore they cannot just go and make a payment in a branch bank, etc. But there are also issues in terms of financial that make that financial inclusion more difficult, which are related to the caring of the family. They have less freedom of movement. They have to stay a lot more at home. They have to also issues in terms of how do they manage the cash flows. They have to make up for the necessities of a household in terms of health, nutrition, education, water, energy, let's not forget that as well. So we need to factor these issues in because those are very clear to the needs of the women. And then also we have issues of literacy. Literacy in general, but also digital literacy, which is extremely important in the future. Now, we all know that most of the credit that are being done is mostly asset-based lending. So if a woman doesn't have a land title, she will have no credit. If she doesn't have credit history, she will have no credit. So these issues need to be addressed. If a woman cannot travel easily, she will not be able to access markets. If she doesn't travel easily again, she cannot open an account or even build up her network of people that will actually she would set up an enterprise with. Another very important issue that we found in financial inclusion and also entrepreneurship in women around the globe has been women do not have an ID, an identification. It's very difficult for them to open an account. So I think it's extremely important to also address these issues.
So we have a lot of issues, but they are all related to financial inclusion, and that's the reason, as I understand you, why you focus so much on that. Let's stick a little bit with this question, and I would like to turn to you, Minister Freeland. About 2 months ago, your Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and US President Trump launched a new initiative to champion female business owners, again related to financial inclusion. That sounds great, but I have to ask, in the year 2017, do we really need more councils, or do we need practical advice and practical progress?
Well, thank you for the question. And let me start by saying c'est un très grand plaisir pour moi, Madame le Chancelier, d'être ici en Allemagne. Je suis la ministre des Affaires étrangères du Canada. Je dois dire quelques mots en français. I know there's no translation from French, but we're a bilingual country. And I do want to start by really thanking Chancellor Merkel for inviting us all here and for having the courage to put this issue so firmly on the G20 agenda. It's really important, and kudos. It's a great question, and you're right that a strong view that Canada had, and that I know Ivanka really championed in the White House, was that as part of the first meeting between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump, we wanted there to be an element of what we felt was a really shared agenda between the President and the Prime Minister, which was championing women entrepreneurs. And I think it was one of the most successful elements of our summit, this meeting of the Canada-US Women's Business Council. Look, I used to be a journalist. I'm familiar with the criticism of, why do you need more councils? You need to have action. And I agree with that. Of course we need action. But you do need a group of actors in order to move forward. And I'm very proud of the group of Canadian and US businesswomen who came together. They are working very hard. The idea is that the initiative would strongly come from them with support from our governments. And this is a group of very powerful, very dynamic, very creative women leaders. One of the issues that came up during that meeting was women's access to capital. And we've been talking about it very much in a developing world context. But one of the members of the council is a Canadian woman entrepreneur, and she said, you know what? It's just harder for a woman out there, even in Canada. We like to think of ourselves as an enlightened country. You know, our Prime Minister is a feminist. He appointed a 50-50 gender balanced cabinet. Yay for Justin Trudeau. But, you know, as Queen Maxima said, we are very aware that, you know, we don't have a female leader. I accept that, Chancellor. Touché. So, you know, as Queen Maxima said, we are very aware in Canada, I think in the United States too, that of course supporting women entrepreneurs, girls' education in the developing world is a great development tool, but we also have a lot of work still to do at home. And I very much believe that this Canada-US Women's Business Council is going to take a real leadership role on both fronts.
What we are also partly missing, Your Majesty alluded to that, referring to women not having IDs, for example, and we're missing figures and facts in lots of ways. So I would like to ask you, Madame Lagarde, from a macroeconomic standpoint, do the numbers, you know, on an international scale, tell a frustrating or a motivating story?
Both.
Would you embellish on that a little bit, please?
Promise.
Thank you.
Well, I want to say Dankeschön, merci beaucoup, thank you so much to the Chancellor, because you know, the first W20 that took place was 2 years ago in Turkey. To have it now in Germany under your leadership at the highest level of the country and under joint initiatives, as I understand, to have it promoted as one of the key items of the G20 agenda is fantastic. So thank you very, very much. And I would add that in addition to money that is needed for any initiatives, and you've alluded to that, Chrystia, and you too, Queen Maxima, we also need not just actors, we need activists. Because, to come back to your question, it's a really disappointing situation that we're facing. And at the same time, it can be really energizing and exciting because there's so much room for progress. You mentioned the 30% women entrepreneurs. Well, in low-income countries, it's even lower than that. As soon as you move to the medium-sized enterprises, it goes down to 20%. And if you look at how much access they have to financing, bank account, loans, it's about 2/5 of that 20% over 40 employees. So it's a really ridiculously small amount that can have access to financing. So that's number one. Number two, the point I would like to make in response to your question, is that it's an economic no-brainer from a macro point of view. Because women's empowerment and participation in the economy are a triple bonus. Bonus number one, they boost growth. And everybody around the world wants growth, wants jobs. If you were to close the gender gap in the United States, the economy is automatically bigger by 5%. If you do the same thing in India, you're talking about 23%. If you do the same thing in Japan, you're talking about 9%. So there is, in all societies, whether they are low incomes, emerging or advanced, there is a bonus to be had by having women join the economy. That's bonus number one.
Who's missing the brain in not taking advantage of the no-brainer?
Let me get to the other two, because we have three bonuses. The second one is that by the same token, you reduce inequality. You reduce the gender gap, you reduce inequality. It is demonstrated empirically now by anybody, except a few heretics, that if you reduce inequality, you have more growth and it is more sustainable. So that's also critically important. Third bonus, you have a more diversified economy that has more exports, more trade with each other, and it's really also a growth booster. So from those 3 points of view, it's critically important to bring women to the table. Why don't they come? Well, I think we have something to do about it. And that's the energizing part. I will be activist for a second, if you allow me. There are, at the moment, some pension funds, some big investors who are saying to the companies in which they've invested, give us the numbers. Tell us what is the gender difference between salaries at the same level. And a lot of them are saying, oh, we're doing so much already, it's okay, you know, we are heading in the right direction. No, give us the numbers. And then we can measure, and then we can move forward.
Mrs. Finucane, maybe we stick with the numbers for a moment, because there are studies, there is research that companies having women on board and in executive management perform financially better than those who don't.
True. And we're an example. We have 40% of our executive management team are women, 30% of the board are women. Almost 30% are also people of color. And that makes a difference because the conversation is different. And to even go back to something Chrystia just said, I do think that there is an importance to councils coming together, because it is difficult. I'll speak from a financial institution. When you're trying to make decisions like unsecured loans, as Queen Maxima just raised, you need to think about, in a financial system, how to de-risk something. That means syndicating that loss. That means coming together with other financial institutions. The piece today that Ivanka Trump and Jim Kim put out in the FT speaks to that, creating a fund of sorts. But the financial institutions, I think, are more prepared than ever, because we see the kind of growth, the kind of opportunity that Ms. Lagarde just spoke about. And of course, success begets success. And just in the United States alone, we've seen enormous growth with women in small business. They are more reliable. They will put more money back into the community. And for those reasons alone, it's important. But without the council, without the discussion about the practical issues of de-risking or syndicating both loss and profit, then it's very difficult to think that this is just going to take off. So although that can seem cumbersome, without it, it's not going to happen.
Mrs. Trump, your op-ed in the FT was just mentioned already. Before we get a little bit deeper into that, I would like to take a minute to clarify something. You're the first daughter of the United States, and you're also an assistant to the US president. As a part of the audience, especially the German audience, is not that familiar with the concept of a first daughter, I'd like to ask you, what is your role, and whom are you representing? Your father as the President of the United States, the American people, or your business?
Well, certainly not the latter. And I am rather unfamiliar with this role as well, as it is quite new to me. It has been a little under 100 days, but it has just been a remarkable and incredible journey. So, you know, as an entrepreneur and as an individual prior to this in the private sector, I cared very much about empowering women in the workplace. And the opportunity to have an elevated platform, to be able to sit here on this stage, and thank you, Chancellor, for your very gracious invitation. I'm humbled to be here with so many formidable leaders to engage in dialogue, to learn, to bring the advice, to bring the knowledge back to the United States, back to both my father and the President, and hopefully that will bring about incremental positive change, and that is my goal. So this is very early for me. I'm listening, I'm learning, I'm defining the ways in which I think that I'll be able to have impact. I'm seeking the counsel, to use your word, of informed and thoughtful women and men. And I'm really striving to think about how best to empower women in the economy, both domestically and across the globe, because it's all interrelated. So it's been wonderful to date, and I have no doubt that coming out of this trip, I'll be all the more informed.
Yeah, you wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times today where you wrote, "We know what works regarding women in business." And if we know what works, first question, why don't we do it? And the second question, are you sure that what works for you as a first daughter will also work for every other woman in the world?
No, I think we represent 50% of the population, so there is no one size fits all when you think about women in the workplace or women as job creators. And then you have the cultural overlay, which differs from country to country, from region to region, within countries. There are enormous problems. I feel fortunate in America that those problems are less than in other areas of the world when we think about gender inequality, but we still have formidable problems in our own right. When you think about the fact that 30% of U.S. privately owned businesses are women businesses, that leaves tremendous potential for growth and for engagement. Of that 30%, only 16% of those businesses have employees beyond the owner. So when you think about the potential women have, both to expand as entrepreneurs and to become more robust employers with our economy, it's incredibly exciting. There's a lot of wood to chop, and we're not right there. We're not there yet. And I think one of the interesting things is the problems are identifiable. We know what they look like, and they're the same across the globe, just with varying degrees of severity. The solutions and the tactical means to get to the right outcome will differ. And I think one of the great opportunities we have as we travel and as we talk to knowledgeable and informed people is to find out what's worked in their countries and cultures. I know that Chancellor Merkel, just this past March, you passed an equal pay legislation to promote transparency and to try to finally narrow that gender pay gap. And that's something we should all be looking at to see the efficacy of that policy as it gets rolled out. So this is a robust, dynamic, and ever-moving discussion. It's a political discussion. It's policy-oriented as we think about paid leave, sadly, the United States is one of the only countries in the world, the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a paid leave policy for the benefit of families. So that is something I'm very, very proud of my father's advocacy. Long before he came into the presidency, but during the campaign, including in the primaries, he's been a tremendous champion of supporting families and enabling them to thrive in the new reality of
you
dual
hear
income.
the reaction from the audience, so I need to address one more point. Some attitudes towards women your father has publicly displayed in former times might leave one questioning whether he's such an empowerer for women. How do you relate to that? Or are things changing? Or what's your comment on that?
I've certainly heard the criticism from the media, and that's been perpetuated. But I know from personal experience, and I think the thousands of women who have worked with and for my father for decades when he was in the private sector are a testament to his belief and solid conviction in the potential of women and their ability to do the job as well as any man. So I think in my personal experience, and you were asking me about my role as daughter and also advisor, as a daughter, I can speak on a very personal level, knowing that he encouraged me and enabled me to thrive. I grew up in a house where there was no barriers to what I could accomplish beyond my own perseverance and my own tenacity. And I don't take that lightly as a parent now myself. That's not an easy thing to do, and he did that, and he provided that for us. There was no difference for me and my brothers. And I think as a business leader, you saw that, and as a president, you will absolutely see that.
We will be curious and watching. Thank you. Mrs. Leibinger-Kammerer, you are an example how a woman can successfully run a business. You inherited and took over a long-standing family-owned business. Do you think you would have become an entrepreneur either way, regardless of your family history?
I don't think so. I have to be honest. And I'll switch into German now because Chancellor Merkel and I agreed that we are on German grounds, and we are Germans.
To speak German. Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm wondering whether you would have asked a man the same. Yes, I would have asked him. You would? Well, that may be. With respect to my education, I'm not an engineer or an economist. I'm a linguist, but because of my parents and the company, I was always interested in business. I grew up in the company. Perhaps I would have chosen a different profession, but I used the opportunity because before I got into management, I worked in the company, and so it made sense.
Do women get specific attention at Trump, at your company, to be empowered, accelerated in whatever way?
Well, we have, of course, working hour models that are revolutionary in Germany. I think every 2 years you can specify how much you want to work. 40%, 60% you can work remotely. But we also offer the same thing to men. So I want to say clearly, we only will have a chance if we take the men along. So we have couples in our company. There are many who basically have shifts that they coordinate. So they say, well, you work 60 or 80% for a couple of years, and I take care of the children or the animals, or I take care of older people. And then we change around, and we do the same thing with cooperating companies. For example, we have Bosch very close by, and we have an exchange of opinions. So basically, you can have adjusted shifts. So we have to work with them and not against them.
That's a good statement, like the applause showed you. We are an all-female panel, which is an exemption, and so something very interesting, but still it's about women and men to take the task together. Mrs. Rotic, you were named Social Entrepreneur of the Year 2011 in Africa by the World Economic Forum, and were most recently among Forbes' World's 50 Greatest Leaders. What's your motivation for becoming an entrepreneur?
Thank you very much for that kind question. My motivation is solving problems. Clearly, we've got lots of intractable problems around the world. When it comes to some of the problems we see around data collection, the collaboration with my friends and colleagues at the time led to us creating Ushahidi, which is a crowdsourcing platform, and also an organization that has since gone on to create more types of software and also to create other companies in Kenya. So the motivation is really solving problems, be it the information flow problem, and then later with BRIC, handling problems around connectivity, where we have issues around electricity, unreliability. That's truly that's the basis of my motivation. And I think, just to go back to the question of problems, if we look at some of the emerging problems right now that are of a global nature, one of those is climate change. And that affects many people around the world. And unfortunately, the people who bear the brunt of conflicts, of changes in weather patterns, be it farmers or people in the informal economy, that burden is carried by women. If we can just paint a picture, and if you see a visual of a woman carrying a child on their back and having to flee from one area because of lack of resources, lack of access to water, access to education. So these are really big problems that not only require us to have global interventions, but also to bring to bear the innovation that we are seeing actually in the developing countries. There's a fantastic company called Farm Drive, which is supported by M-Pesa Foundation and others. And even companies like Safaricom with M-Pesa that are looking at these problems and figuring out how they are responding to those problems through business. The question here for us today here is, what are the concrete, practical things that we can do to shore up the international partnerships that we need, so that when that woman is carrying that child and fleeing from a conflict, is there a support system where she is going? Are there financial systems that she can tap into, identity systems that she can tap into? Is she going into places where there's an ecosystem that can help them to succeed? Because many of them are also small-scale entrepreneurs.
The described conditions, living conditions you were alluding to, differ very much in different parts of the world. So if we take a look at Germany, one of the leading industries and economies in the world, Madam Chancellor Merkel, we did an interview last year together, and you told me you could picture yourself managing a cafe or a restaurant, which I found very inspiring and interesting. And now in the preparation for this panel, I asked myself, if the first female Chancellor of Germany has such an entrepreneurial spirit, why is it still the case that only 1 out of 10 startups in Germany is founded by a woman?
Well, perhaps just like I wasn't able to do until now, that is to have a startup, many others will have the same experience because there's still many barriers. But first of all, let me return the thanks that was expressed here. I want to thank the German Women's Council and all the female entrepreneurs who have arranged this event of civil society and arranged the panel so that it can take place in Germany, because for us it's very important that the G20 is not just a process of politicians, but that many parts of society, young people, trade unions, women are included. But the fact that women represent more than 50% of our society, and the fact that we have a separate panel for them shows that we still have some things to do here. Of course, also in Germany, we can say that the female entrepreneurs are not represented as a majority. We want to encourage people, just as it is the case in the developing countries. And therefore, it was a very interesting experience when I visited the American President Donald Trump, and I observed how the visit of the Canadian Prime Minister had taken place. And I think there was a very interesting discussion round with female entrepreneurs at that time, and it showed what progress could be made. And I think then during my visit, we did something similar. That is, we talked about skills, that is, vocational training of young people. How can our companies get better? And this combination, skills and then also the courage to start a business, is something that can add up, and this must apply the same to developing countries as it does to our advanced countries. This is a new model, and we have a role model, and therefore, as Mrs. Leidinger-Kammüller can speak from her own experience from the company and can offer much that shows how family and work can be compatible, so that is terribly important. What is very important to me, and one reason why Ivanka Trump is here, that is the idea, which is also currently being discussed with the World Bank, how can we improve access to financial means? We want to improve that, and that is something that we want to have introduced to the political process of the G20, and perhaps we can have an answer later on, because I have the following idea. The G20 process, we have the idea of closing the gap between the genders with respect to work. We currently have about 50% of the women that work and about 74 or 76% of men. This has to be closed, and as Christine Lagarde already said, it has great impact on growth. But then we have the question of entrepreneurship, and we know from microloans, microcredits, nothing is as successful as credits to women, because they are much closer to the family life, and their development actually impacts families much more. And so we have to consider, how can we get from government support to true economic development, and to change that from the microcredits to actual loans and credits. This is an area where we have to make efforts both in our advanced countries and in our developing countries. And if you look at the interest rates, even in the development banks, it shows that the interest rates are so high that nobody can get loans, and especially women. And therefore the idea is to establish a special facility that would provide access to women, especially in the developing countries, because credit worthiness, and this has been proven by the microcredits, was better for women. The defaults were lower because women thought better about that. Could you say something about that special facility? Well, a special facility should mean that we consider looking for countries among the G20 nations, and I think Germany might participate. We invited the Dutch as a partner country, Canada might participate, the United States might, but we could also ask some private sources whether they would contribute, and then we would have that as a fund. And the World Bank then has the possibility, because of its loan capabilities, to leverage it, that, for example, 20 million become 200, or 200 can become 2 billion, and then you could work with that. And that could be made available to women in the developing countries, and we are trying to discuss that with all the other participants of the G20, and if we have a good approach today, then we have made major progress.
Would you like to comment on that?
Sure thing. I think that would be a really great first step, and I think your point about microcredit is actually quite apropos, I think. And the really encouraging thing is there are African women in Kenya and in other parts of Africa who are creating financial technology companies. An example is Paris in Kenya with her co-founder who created a company called Farm Drive. And they do alternative scoring by creating a profile of farmers and providing credit to those farmers. So we're starting to see the creation of second generation and third generation enterprises on the basis of financial technology systems like the ones that the Queen supported. M-Pesa is the first sort of base platform on which some of these services are being created. So it's very encouraging, and I hope that some of that fund can also be provided for supporting innovation and technology, because I think innovation and technology can help to accelerate the inclusion of women and making it not just transactional inclusion but also transformational, and helping to lift more people out of poverty by making them more wealthy.
Yeah. I think this is a very important point as we think towards not only the present but the future, and you look at the role that technology is increasingly playing in all of our lives. We don't go online, we live online. And yet, women, while this provides tremendous opportunity for the upside, there's also a challenge that exists today, and there is a digital gender divide that is emerging. And when you look across the globe and you see that 1.7 billion women don't have access to a smartphone, and you think about that as a deterrent for them fully participating in the economy of present as well as the economy of the future. Plus, you think about the role of skill-based education, and this is something that I was very excited to hear from Chancellor Merkel and her team of incredible entrepreneurs from Germany that she brought to the US in conjunction with some remarkable entrepreneurs of our own to really discuss the role of vocational education and skill-based training. And I think as we look at how that affects and impacts this next generation of women and girls, it's a critical thing to focus on the role of STEM and the fact that women's participation in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, is actually moving in the wrong direction, despite the fact that when you think about the future, so many of the highest paying, most lucrative jobs are coming in that arena. You see the divide at a corporate level, at a leadership level, but just in terms of the number of students graduating with those degrees. So for women in the United States, in a field like computer science, the numbers have gone from the low 30s to now the low 20s over the course of a little over a decade. So that is something that we really have to think about how to reverse through messaging, through education, engaging girls in STEM fields much younger, and integrating that into the curriculum in a modern and updated way that inspires and engages them. And that's something that's become a huge priority for the administration and something that we're very focused on.
Madame Lagarde.
Do you allow me to pay tribute to the Chancellor first? And if you want to transition to digital, I would like to follow up from what Juliana was saying. Yeah? Okay, thank you. And I want to bring policies, micro and macro, together on that point. On the policy front, the announcement of this setting up of the Women Entrepreneurs Fund is fantastic. But I think it doesn't go without policies. And I'm known in Germany for complaining about the surplus of Germany. Okay, I know that.
Not only.
But not only. And that's and I really want to pay tribute to the Chancellor for the spending, the public spending in childcare centers and the efforts that have been put into the budget for that. Yeah. So now I want to...
You can include former and current female and family ministers.
Yes, of course. Yeah, female ministers included, of course. Following up on Juliana's point, I think it's a fantastic move into the digital that you want us to touch on, because the real story that Juliana is explaining to us actually brings together the private sector that you just mentioned, but also the central bank. And this is how the story goes. You correct me if I get that wrong. The central bank realized suddenly that the number of micro loans were massive between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. in the morning. In other words, using the M-Pesa system, which is essentially mixing banking and telecommunication together, they found out that there were those massive microcredit taken out at that time of the day. Why was that? Because the women who were the street retailers were actually taking out microcredit at that point in time in order to pay the wholesaler. They were calling the little moped driver who would actually take the vegetable and the fruit to the corner where they work. In the meantime, they were looking after the family, sometimes fetching water, sometimes looking after the kids to make sure that they went to school, so that at 6 a.m., once everybody had been paid, the wholesaler, the moped rider, they could go on the street corner, do their business, and at the end of the day, they would reimburse the microcredit that they had borrowed at that time of the day. Now, where the micro and the macro go together is that the central bank was able to actually identify those movements, identify the women who were doing that business, and to build a credit history that then allowed them to have access to much better financing. And that's a fantastic story of how digital can actually be leveraged in order to move the financing from the micro to something much bigger. It's a fantastic Kenyan story.
Can you relate to that in regard to your role?
Definitely. I mean, we've been there when in Kenya we started sort of rolling out Safaricom and all the regulatory challenges that they brought. And you were really working with a lot of countries trying to change those rules of regulations to make digital mobile banking finance possible. And like you said, Ms. Lagarde, it's extremely important, and certainly for women this holds great potential. Because, you know, women, like you very well mentioned, they have other realities than men. You know, sometimes they have to stay at home. They have much more needs for privacy, for example. They are much more prone to theft issues. They need to keep their money away from the husbands and other family members so they can actually, no, but you know, you're laughing, but they have to pay the school fees. They have to pay the next doctor's bills. And this is not a money that should actually be spent on frugalities. And this is extremely important for women to have their own safe place to keep their money. And also in that way, also build credit history. When the mobile financial service sees that this woman actually pays her account and she handles, in your case, 10,000 shillings every day, 50,000 shillings every day, this woman can actually get a working capital loan of easy 50,000 shillings, which before was not possible. She can even start then building on and actually have insurance, because the issue is not so much getting people out of poverty, but actually keeping them out of poverty. Because one drought, one flood, like it happened in North Kenya, and then it's all back to zero. So it's extremely important that digital financial services actually are given the potential to really make it a reality for women. But she mentioned two things. One is connectivity. And Ms. Trump also mentioned it as well. Connectivity is an issue for women. Not only they have less access to mobile phones, when they do, their phone is actually less smartphone, and then when they do, they actually use it less. So we really need to speak to mobile network operators to see how we can actually give, like, for example, bundles with husband and wives, and they both get the equal type of phone, and they all get the equal type of data. There's a very good example of that in North Iraq. So there's issues like that are actually possible. Then there's also the issue of last mile. There has to be a public good issue about this. Connectivity for women is not a luxury anymore. It's a source of information, it's a way to make payments, it's a way to save, it's a way to get informed about vaccination. So this is extremely important. I even see in projects of paying solar panels on a weekly basis what they're saving on kerosene to actually, through the mobile phone. And it has only been made possible through mobile phones. That's one issue, connectivity. The second issue is most of these mobile network operators don't even know how many women they have as clients. They don't really know what actually these, they don't even have women as a special segment. I think that we really need to be much more customer-centric, because even there's a lot of mobile bank accounts around in the world, the usage is a big issue. And it has to do with digital literacy. It has to do because the products are not really catered to women. So giving a special service from 3 to 5 o'clock in the morning is extremely important. To tell them, for example, not just a savings account, but when they get harvest, to really basically advertise now you can save until you start planting again, so that she can really keep all that money and have a huge increase in yield in terms of farming. That is extremely important. We have to study the needs, the underlying needs of women, to really design the product so they can really make use of it and have a fantastic social impact.
But that's almost unbelievable that the telecommunication providers don't even know about their female clients. I would like to take this to you, Mrs. Finnecane. Is that true, or does Bank of America at least have a very specific big data-oriented approach to serve female customers and even develop programs or entrepreneurial approaches?
Well, Bank of America operates mostly in developed countries, and of course we do have big databases, and it's easy to evaluate, and of course we use that. But just to speak to the idea of microcredit, the challenge with microcredit isn't only that they're very high rates, too high, and they're not sustainable. The only way to diminish that is to create scale. The only way to create scale is to have the data. So big financial institutions or NGOs will come together if they have enough data. Just to use the United States as an example, there are banks. There are also, for what we call micro-lending, there are community development financial institutions. The way they work is the banks lend to the community development financial institutions, who in turn lend to men and women, small businesses. Their credit isn't as good. They're probably in an earlier stage, so they wouldn't be, from a regulatory perspective, bank ready. And yet, because we can lend to the community development organizations, they can lend to the individual. They can do it at much lower interest rates. And this is what we need to do on a global scale. Now that essentially is what I think we're talking about in terms of the World Bank, to be able to aggregate enough banks, enough financial institutions who will lend to community development groups, who will then lend at lower rates along with an education piece.
So what we're coming at is that in the digital economy, the two factors you were both talking about, like financial inclusion and credit availability on the one hand side, and literacy or digital literacy on the other hand side, must come together, and they can come together.
No, not only that. I think that if you give a credit, also coaching, giving women access to markets, it's not just one silver bullet. You have to give the whole combination of issues. She has to have access to financial services. At the same time, she has to have some kind of coaching, some kind of access to market, and then her whole family situation has to also need to take care of, because she will drop her enterprise if a family is having a hard time. So we need to. It's not a one issue. No. It has to be a concerted effort of many different interventions.
And how
we've
difficult?
We've talked quite a bit about the lack of access to credit and the lack of access to markets that are unique barriers for women, that are disproportionately adversely affecting women in the economy, the global economy. But I think there's one other element that I hear time and time again, traveling around the country, traveling around America, and increasingly as I travel through the world, lack of mentors. And I think mentorship, it's an interesting challenge to solve, because there certainly isn't one solution for it, but women time and time again value the mentorship and value the community and the advice and the guidance. And when you talk to female entrepreneurs, their networks are smaller than their male counterparts. They have less natural sources of deal flow and less people to help propel them through the system. So I think this is something we have to be thinking about as well, creating true mentorship opportunities for women, to encourage women and also men to take it upon themselves to foster this next generation and to encourage their growth and to mentor them through the process.
Minister Freeland, is that one part of the Joint Council, that also mentorship, role modeling is needed and provided?
Absolutely, and that's something that our council members are very enthusiastic about. And they're enthusiastic also about, as one of them put it, forcing our male colleagues to do the same thing. And that's really, really important. And, I do want to say, I was hoping to work this in, Christine, because mentors are so important for all of us. And Christine Lagarde has been a mentor for me. And it's really important, right? It's important for women to support other women. And I'm really grateful to all the women who are here today. You know, you are all successful leaders. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. And I know that you're going to go back home and support other women, and that is tremendously important. And as Ivanka said, it's important that mentorship not be seen as something that only women can do for other women. We had a little bit of a discussion of fathers, and they used to say that behind every successful man was an even more successful woman. I have a view, which is backed up by sociological research, that behind every successful woman is a very supportive father. There is a very strong correlation between supportive fathers and female professional success. So we know something about the fathers of everyone who is sitting here. But I wanted to make one other point about this sort of virtuous circle that we've been talking about supporting female entrepreneurship. And, we've been talking about this strong economic arguments in favor, get women involved in the workforce. And as the Chancellor pointed out, you just have more economic growth. It's absolutely true. Get women involved in the workforce, they have more money and they spend it on their kids and their families. So there's a positive social cascading effect. But I'm a politician, so I want to bring in the politics. And I do think we have to remember, as we're working on these programs, there is a reason women have been excluded. There are very deep political and social reasons women have been cut out of positions of economic power. And efforts, which I know we're all leading, that are going to bring women into greater positions of power are going to be controversial. They're going to cause conflict in families and societies. And I think part of what we need to do is be very aware of that. And part of the effort also needs to be political. And it needs to be about saying, you know what? It's good for the mother to have some control of the family budget. It's good for your daughter to be going to school and to be delaying marriage and to be going out there and getting a job. And I think that we have to be very upfront about that in any programs that we're building. And frankly, we have to be upfront about the fact that there are still challenges in all of our own societies around female leadership and women really being in charge of money, which is that key thing.
I would like to turn that over to Mrs. Leibinger-Kamiller, because you've been an outspoken opponent to regulation regarding topics Minister Freeland was alluding to, like quotas or also the German equal pay law, which you are not so in love with, let me put it like that. So what does it mean? If we do not get things going by really setting the stage, even by political measures, by regulation, does it mean you want things just to stay how they are?
Well, I don't think I run the danger to act against women here. The question you raised fits very well to what I want to say. And I don't really want to spoil the good mood here, but I would like to say that from my own experience, and I'm going to say something about the women's quota, I want to talk about my own company, and that's only what it applies to. It's very difficult to motivate women. We offer a tremendous amount. I mentioned already the good working hours, the good working models, the flexibility, all these topics, mentoring, all sorts of topics. We really are very supportive. Nevertheless, we have to force many women. We basically have to force them to take executive positions, and they have concerns. Perhaps it's just the women in the southern German area, in the area of Stuttgart, that they are particularly conservative, but we have to overcome a lot of reticence. And if the women say, but we have children at home, and then the Latin grades are going to go down, and the boys never study anyway, I have to be home, etc. So it does not only depend on the circumstances, but you really have to force the women to accept certain management positions, and that has to be done. And with respect to the women's quota, I really don't like the regulatory action. I don't like it when the government gets involved in our business. And I have to say that I introduced a secret quota in my company because I demanded that when we are filling a management position, that at least one female candidate has to be part of it. Then things are changed. But I'm talking specifically about regulatory policy having as little interference by government, because we can do it ourselves. Well, first of all, let me say, I'm really impressed by how Mrs. Leibinger-Kammermüller has brought new atmosphere in her business because of her own different perspective, because she has her own family, and, for example, not having studied economics or business administration, which shows that business is not so unusual that nobody who studied something else could even ever lead a management, that you have to be a lawyer or an economist or business administrator, otherwise you can't even get involved, and that's true. You can study languages and still manage a business. So that's the first thing. The second, well, of course, because you already have basically a tunnel where you can't even get into if you're not part of it. And the second, and that's a constant back and forth, and there are political discussions, and there are different ideas about it, namely how much regulatory action do you need, how much legislative action, and how much can you do through volunteer activities or incentives. And I must say, after German unification, I became an active citizen in West Germany, and initially I was against having a quorum in my political party, but we found that ultimately you have to have a woman in the final selection, and then all of a sudden you have one there. And first you didn't have any, and then for years, and Mrs. Leibinger-Kammermüller, you are in the management committees. We always asked and begged them. We were not able to get the DAX companies to have 1/3 of their membership filled with women. They actually are responsible for having that law passed against them. I had the honor of being women's minister from 1990 to 1994. If you have a women's minister that comes to me in the year 2013 and she says we still have less than 10% executives, then I can't say we can wait for another 50 years. Ultimately, we found women who are willing to take these positions, and now we go on. We have additional controversial discussions. I personally think that even in the transparency of equal pay for equal work, we found a good solution, but nobody knew it, by the way. That was really interesting. There was really nobody who knew it except for one person, that we have a law that provides that works councils have the right to find out about pay levels for women and men. The representatives of the works councils, who are usually men, didn't really mention it, and the women didn't know about it. So you have to go and break up those barriers. And then the last point that I wanted to raise, there are many discussions that we have had also in the federal government regarding the glass ceiling with women. What is the reasons that women don't want to accept executive positions? And I think two things are important for me. First, there aren't that many role models, and therefore the role models are terribly important. If you show how it is, then it becomes more normal. If a woman with 2 small children can show that their boys still study for school, then they can do it. But women are under great stress, and their husband says, well, you can go ahead, but if things don't work out, he's not going to say, I'm going to give up my management position. It's always the women who then are responsible, and therefore the fathers and the men are very important. For example, if the fathers then leave work for 3 months and find that taking care of a child can really be something that brings you joy, that they have a closer relationship to the children, and then the priorities get shifted, and they say, well, perhaps parental leave is not such a bad thing, and suddenly something changes in the entire balance of the family, and that is very important.
Question, Madam Chancellor, after your brave intervention, do you consider yourself a feminist?
interesting reaction.
To be honest, I do not want to. Well, the history of feminism is one where there are some commonalities and there are some areas where there are differences. And I would not want to assume a title that is not appropriate for me. For example, if you look at Alice Schwarzer, they had very hard struggles. And now I'm going to sit down and say, well, I'm a feminist now. Isn't that great? So I'm not afraid of it. If you think so, you can vote on it, but I do not want to claim something that I'm not entitled to.
Does anybody on this panel consider herself a feminist? Let's hands up. Who's considering herself a feminist on the panel?
Then
what's in a name? What's in a name? I just want that all women have a freedom of a choice, that they have opportunities that they can grab, and they can pass those opportunities and feel equal in every floor and really be happy and proud of themselves. If that is a feminist, I'm a feminist. But otherwise,
then I am one too.
So before everybody is freaking out.
Mrs. Leibinger, did you also raise your hand? No, but I didn't want to out myself as a feminist. Well, the explanation by Queen Maxima is wonderful. I just want to add a small history again from the South, where we're very conservative and backwards, and link it to what the Chancellor said, that is when the young men change the babies and all the things that are involved. I can say we have a different experience. We have the same experience that the fathers have closer contact with the children, but we also have made the experience that the men come back and they say, God, I'm so glad that 3 months are over. I didn't know how much work it was, and now I can appreciate what the women do, and therefore parental leave is very important. Well, but when we had the law, were you for it? Absolutely. And I had to implement it. I had cases in the company that came to me and they said my bosses, who were men, didn't want to let me go and threatened that my career is ended. You have to imagine that. And can you do something for me? And I did that. And I said, stay away for 6 months.
So I like it that the atmosphere is heating up a bit, and this was a very, very interesting part of this panel, I guess. But I was serious about it, and I didn't just want to make jokes about it, because I'm a little bit wondering whether there is some sort of a new reluctance to use this word, and that is related with the fact that we are facing some parts of a backlash towards liberal rights these days, and also towards women's rights. Minister Freeland, would you like to comment on that? Do you feel that that women's progress is not linear, and we are in the need to fight more these days again?
You know, I think one of the lessons of the world today is the progress of liberal democracy and liberal democratic values in the world is not linear in general, right? There was a moment, Chancellor Merkel referred to German unification. I was a reporter at that time. There was that, I think it was a glorious moment when the wall came down, when the Soviet Union ended, and some of us celebrated the end of history. And Francis Fukuyama wrote that famous book, which I think was very well intentioned, right, with this idea that, you know, the problem had been solved and that the whole world understood that all humans really had so much in common, and we were all yearning towards liberal democratic values, in which I would very much include women's rights and feminism, and I'm happy to explicitly call myself a feminist. And I think what we've been learning over the past few years in a whole bunch of areas, very much including women's rights, is that we can't take them for granted. And that's what I was alluding to a bit by talking about the political aspect of what we're discussing. There's a reason that women have been economically excluded in all societies, actually. There's no society in the world where women have fully equal rights. There is a reason for that, and I think a big part of our response needs to be very much about smart policies. And Ivanka's point in her op-ed that we know what to do, I think is an excellent point. So much policy work has been done, and if we just did all the smart things that smart policy wonks agree on, we would make huge progress. But I don't think that we can neglect the political side of things and neglect the fact that there are a lot of forces in a lot of societies, including my own, who would feel more comfortable, with the woman staying at home, with the dad not having to take the paternity leave and change those wretched diapers. So, yeah, I think there is.
Madame Lagarde, where's the connection between the liberal rights, free trade, all those kinds of things, and what we are talking about, women's progress?
Well, clearly empowerment, that's the juncture. But to follow up what Chrystia was saying, one of the reasons women historically in many societies, not all, but in many societies have been excluded, is that the feeling that a lot of men have, who are in positions, in power and so on and so forth, feel threatened by women. And I think that what's clearly demonstrated by this panel is that women are not a threat. They are a positive contributor to the well-being of society. And they can be empowered. I just want to add two things. One is I've been leading organizations both in the private and in the public sector, and I have not yet met any woman who offered the space and the comfort to have her children looked after safely, and given the training to actually exercise leadership in confidence, had to be forced. So there may have been something wrong in the translation of what you were saying in German, but frankly, if there is the space for the domestic activity on the one hand, and that relies on policies, and second, the training, the encouragement, women take the challenge. They're brave, they're strong. If those two conditions are satisfied, absent them, I agree with you. Final point. Chrystia, you mentioned father. I agree with you, but I just want to say that to all the women who either never had a father because they did not know him or lost their father, you can pick and choose a father. They exist around and they can be tremendous mentors. And I hope we can support that idea because nobody should feel left out in that game. And I know you feel strongly for that.
Mrs. Trump, we have talked about the political environment, the developments, the current affairs, and I would like to know regarding women in business, the success of women in business, the relationship to empowerment, like Mrs. Lagarde just said, and open societies and free trade. How are you advising your father in this regard, also regarding the international relationships that empower women in business as well?
Well, it's been an ongoing discussion I've had with my father most of my adult life, and we're very aligned in many, many areas, and that's why he's encouraged me to fully lean into this opportunity and come into the White House and be by his side as we think through these complex issues. Even here today, we've all acknowledge the problems, and we have very different views on the right solution, whether legislatively or otherwise, in terms of how to get to the desired end goal. So I think that in the areas where I'm fully aligned with my father, which are many, which is around the empowerment of women in our economy and really unleashing them. And there are ways to do this more globally, just for all entrepreneurs. And then there are specific tactics that pertain and are most relevant for women in our workplace. But we had talked about the regulatory burden. There's an enormous regulatory burden that's been placed on American business owners, and that's slowly being lifted. So there are definitely regulations that are good ones, and then there are ones that are stifling. And I think when the economy can flourish as a whole, that benefits women. But I think the policy component is very important. I think safe, affordable childcare is essential. And it is sadly something that is not available in most areas of the world, including in the United States, and has been a big priority for me and the administration, because when you think of the wage gap, it's really exasperated by a woman becoming a mother. So motherhood is an additional challenge, and it shouldn't be. And while these are all family issues, obviously childcare is a family issue. And as a millennial, albeit on the older end of the spectrum, I can say that I am really encouraged by what I see in my peer set and what I see in the next generation coming up, where fathers not only are expected by their wives to be equal participants in the households, but they want to be. So I think that's really important as we think about corporate cultures, and so much of this innovation is happening at the private sector. And we talked a lot about that today, the role of councils and really leveraging the best ideas from the private sector and the innovation of the private sector, and then doing what government can do, which is scale, which is amplify. But I am encouraged when I see households and I see men being increasingly engaged and taking on these roles and really disrupting these ideas about gender bias and a woman's role within the context of our households. But thoughtful policies have to support that. And the reality is, in the United States, the single largest cost in over half of American households, the single largest expense is childcare, even exceeding the cost of housing. So it's an enormous problem, and it's one my father is very committed to tackling.
Madam Chancellor.
I just wanted to raise one issue that Christine Lagarde had mentioned regarding the questions whether women are willing to accept executive roles if you have arrangements with childcare. And I must say we have made tremendous progress in Germany, but especially when children start school, and a young mother knows when a child is 3, then you have 3 years, and then they start elementary school, and then I can go back to my career. And I think we have some progress still to make sure that we have child care after school, that women then are able to focus on their work fully, so that we have a proper arrangement. We had long discussions in Germany. Should we do that? And also for younger children, younger than 3 years old, that was very difficult. But ultimately, when you offer childcare, then the acceptance is much greater. We have to say that, because if women always have to prove that they need childcare, then that's not the right approach. You have to make it available, and then we don't have to, for instance, ask, well, do we need roads? If you don't have roads, of course, you can't use them. But if they exist, then you use them.
We made quite a huge round now. We came from liberal values, from free trade and policy, environment and regulation, and have also talked about the micromanagement, let's put it like that, issue of childcare and regulation. I would like to get back to you, Juliana. What's your idea, taking up this whole debate from the perspective of the country you're coming from? Is that what is needed there, or are the priorities still very much diverse?
I think, just to add to some of the conversations about smart policies, how all of these conversations do tie back to this question of smart policies around fundamentals, around education, healthcare. We haven't talked much about healthcare. I think everyone is dancing around that. But maternity leave, reproductive rights, and it was stated by the chair of the Women 20 dialogue earlier, that women's rights are human rights. That in these smart policies, we absolutely have to look at how those policies tally with women's rights, but also human rights and also the rights of people of color. It's really, really important to be as inclusive as possible. So just to tie that back to not only the Kenyan transformation agenda, but also the African transformation agenda, there have been some progress around several key indicators around the number of, the percentage of women in cabinet positions, for example. We still have low percentages of women in CEO positions in Africa. But there's a report by McKinsey and another one by Africa Development Bank that indicates some of these smart policies, and they go back to the fundamentals. If we can really harness and take into account how we safeguard civil rights, women's rights, and human rights in all the policies, we can continue seeing the progress of scaling women entrepreneurship. And last but not least, the key idea after discussing with, as part of the afternoon conversations is when we look at financial technology and the immense potential there is in transforming women's lives, I can't help but think that if we add the component of big data, analytics, and social protection, we can find ways to deal with the refugee crisis. We can find ways to deal with climate change, where we're dispersing certain amounts of money to the most vulnerable. And last but not least, I hope my presence here and those who are watching online can debunk this idea that African women are not part of the solution. We are part and parcel of the creation of the solutions. So include us as we think through the solutions, not only from a technological perspective, but also from a policy perspective, and continuing to advocate for women being at the table, at the highest table.
That was a wonderful approach to take a wholesome picture, and women's rights are human rights, and we need to be very much inclusive in all different imaginable ways to really get going. Thank you for making that very clear. As time is running out, I would like to jump into a very quick last round with all of you. As we are a small but very powerful network of women here on the stage, I would like you to figure out for a moment, what was an idea or a thought or a statement of one other panel on this stage you liked particularly and would like to follow up with? One idea, one statement, one thought from another panelist you really liked and would like to follow up with. Your Majesty, may I start with you?
Lady on my left, partnerships and innovations. Governments, private sectors and NGOs really have to work together in partnership to really make this work. It's going to take a change in regulations. It's going to take sort of from private sector to really look at women as a desirable type of client, but also potential person that works for you, and also a potential supplier for your products. Also NGOs have a fantastic role to play in actually taking that risk that maybe private sector cannot take, of giving that knowledge that the government doesn't know, or helping in picking up that data that we still haven't gathered. I think that partnerships and innovation, taking technology into consideration, will be key for the future, and I will really going to work for it country by country. Thank you.
Thank you. Juliana, what's your idea?
Could you come back to me after?
Mrs. Finucane, what was most impressive for you?
I think I would just take something that struck me as all of you are speaking, that in order for women to move forward, men cannot feel that they are having something taken away, that we all want to step forward together, and that the world is a big place with a lot of opportunity, whether we're talking about GDP or dignity or respect. So the idea that it isn't a takeaway for another group, it is a move forward for all of us.
Thank you. Mrs. Leibinger-Kamüller.
Well, I'm very practical, and I was very impressed when we discussed the fund, whoever that is, World Bank or so, who would contribute, so that women, especially in Africa, would have microcredits available. And you, Madam Chancellor, said that you could conceive that private money could be collected. And I know many people who have a lot of money. And yes, I think especially women, of course, they could be interested in it. I'd love to collect money for it. Well, that's great.
Thank you. Minister Freeland.
I'm going to cheat and say 3 things really fast. So first of all, obviously the fund, and it's great to have private sector support. As the Chancellor said, Canada is very enthusiastic about this, and I really want to also thank Ivanka for how much she's been driving this. Second, we've really been having 2 conversations, right? The problems of some of the people Juliana is talking about, a refugee woman fleeing climate change with a child on her back. That's quite different from women in a wealthy Western country worried about, are they going to get into a middle management position or not? And I think it's important, it's important to talk about these things together, but to recognize that they're different. So my second one is from Juliana. Juliana, I love the story of Farm Drive, and I loved your deeper point, which is the conversation about development can't be somebody coming from outside and empowering women in developing countries. Women in developing countries are extremely smart. They know better than anybody else how to empower themselves. And what we really need to do is, as this fund I hope will do, is create opportunities for them to do it. My third thing I loved most from our developed world was your idea of your secret lists, and that secretly inside your company you insist on always having a woman on the short list. That's something that we're doing in government, and it's amazing. Like, once you say there has to be a woman there, it's amazing how many more women get picked for things, right?
Thank you. Mrs. Trump.
And I think also making women part of the HR process as well. So one of the things that I'm very proud of in the White House, the team that is basically going through the vetting and hiring process for all of government, 6 out of 8 of those people are women. So I think that's very important in terms of making unbiased picks, and as we think about that going forward. But I think one of the key takeaways for me, and there's so many. First of all, I'm grateful for the partnership on the Women's Empowerment Fund that we're going to be launching, and very, very excited to work very hard with everyone here to ensure that it reaches its full potential. But I really think this discussion of inclusion and how big this issue and how nuanced and complex this issue is very important. And I was personally pretty struck by the discussion around the term feminism, because I think as a society we're very prone to labels, and I do label myself a feminist, and I think of that in very broad terms. I think of that as believing in the social, political, and economic equality for all genders. But I do think that there is a feeling of exclusion for a lot of women if they deviate in one small way and in one small area. And I think one of the things we have to do is we have to come together. We have to have discussions such as this one where we can respectfully disagree with one another. And we have to go out into the world, find people who disagree with us, and try and understand their viewpoints. And I think even this discussion around feminism and why it's become so loaded is that I think can be a negativity attached to labeling, because it does feel exclusionary of others. And so it was very interesting to hear the Chancellor's perspective on that. And I do think there's an obligation upon us and upon all women to support and to hold each other up and to be inclusive.
Madame Lagarde.
Well, first of all, I would like to pick up the idea of Queen Maxima and assume that, according to her definition, we are all feminists on this panel, and that we will carry that flag. Second, the proposal that the women's issues be elevated to the G20, not the W20, but the G20 level in some shape or form, And I love the idea of the fund that would be set up and that would leverage private funding. But there is an initiative which you, Chancellor, have launched, which is Compact with Africa, which could pilot that idea, that very principle that you identified in the op-ed. But I think it's good having it as a pilot, because you marry the policies which are absolutely needed, and the investment and the focus and the leverage of public balance sheets to bring more private capital. And I think that if we could experiment Compact with Africa with a special identification of women's issues in that project which you have championed at the G20, it would be terrific. And I'd like to complete with your idea of STEM. We need more women in sciences, in technology, and I think that digital, because the barrier to entry is reasonably low, should offer, if we put education to it, if we put money to it, should offer a way for women to actually be leaders in those fields as well, and not be excluded as the digital revolution changes the way we work, the way we relate to each other. Voilà.
Thank you. Juliana.
The idea for the fund is extremely inspiring, I think, and with the input from this discussion, that it would have a way that it would be inclusive in terms of its thinking, so that its eventual implementation includes and complements a lot of the work that has already been done by not only the central bank governors, some of the organizations that are part of the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and others. So that's truly the idea that I would like to take forward to help to broaden the inputs into the fund idea, so that we have more people at the table helping to think through actually how it'll be implemented, and bringing in some of the inputs from others. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chancellor.
Well, in addition to being forced to think more intensively of whether I'm a feminist or not, and having found a very good definition for it, I would like to mention that it has become clear to me that the fund has great support. Here, I think it is great if Mrs. Leibinger would do something in the private area. Second, through Juliana, I learned that we should use the experience of those that actually are involved in entrepreneurship in Africa, and that we should include that. So we should look who we should talk to in order to refine these ideas, because we're not just talking about collecting capital, leveraging it, but then also using it in such a way that it meets the needs. And for that, of course, we also need digital education and using digital technologies. And something we have to learn too is that many things happen faster in Africa than back at home. For example, using the digital phone, it is the platform which is being used for everything, which is the same thing for our young people, but not for the older generation here. So we want to take that up, and Christine Lagarde is correct. We have two initiatives. Basically, on the one hand, we have the Compact for Africa, where some African countries are discussing concrete economic projects, and we should then use the funds here and discuss it with some of these countries that are ahead already. But of course, we would have to discuss this further. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. But I must say it very frankly, and I think this also applies to my Sherpa and the entire Sherpa staff, we are very motivated now in starting the debates with the 19 other countries. At the end of the week, I will be in South Africa, and we have to discuss also with Argentina and Mexico, because everything is decided in a consensus. But we have some that are basically early supporters of this fund, and I'm very happy that we have this discussion now.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think this was a very productive and inspiring panel. Thank you very much to all the panelists, some newborn feminists like our Chancellor, some who are still debating it inside, Mrs. Leibinger-Kamüller, we will get back to that later. Thanks to the audience for your kind attention, and hopefully this will make a difference and an impact at G20 this year. You will take it there. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you very much, Merkel, for hosting this fantastic panel. Ladies and gentlemen, you can take a photo, but please do not crowd the stage unless you have a special media passport to do so. And of course, remember that the German Chancellor Angela Merkel will return and join us again tomorrow afternoon. And I'm sure we can clarify the question about the feminist and many, many other questions that we can pose to her. I would now like to ask you, as the panel is about to leave the stage, to stay clear of the aisle. Okay, the photographers are still hungry for more pictures. Let's give it to them.